Welcome to the Roundhouse Report. This is Jody Roundhouse. Please subscribe to my channel and click the little bell thing so you get updates because I do breaking news coverage and things like that. This happens to be more historical in context. This is part 2 of why Germany lost World War II. Now, this is part 2 of a series. To recap part 1, I threw away my notes and I haven't rewatched the video. So basically, like, Hitler's the reason why. You can watch that video, why Germany lost World War II, part 1, obviously, in my eyes. Then you'd be able to kind of recap on what I've been talking about. Why on paper, Germany, that's better. On paper, the German military should have won World War II. And there's been people for decades, ever since World War II, that have done counterfactuals after counterfactual. Well, part 1 dealt with something very specific. This is part 2, and this is going to deal with Africa. And Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, which I'm sure you've heard about. He's known as the Desert Fox. It's one of his monikers. Rommel landed in North Africa in 1940 or so, right after the continent of Europe had been conquered by Hitler's Third Reich, Nazi Germany military. They blitzed out, and General Rommel, he had fought in World War I, and in World War II is when he really made a name for himself during the campaign in May of 1940 to conquer Western Europe, to conquer Europe, and they did it in 3 weeks. And they did it using tactics that people like General Rommel spearheaded, and they overtalked the older Prussian high command, and Hitler liked their ideas, so he let them do it. And a quick sidebar, he was known as the Desert Fox when he operated inside of Africa. But prior to Africa, when he was still making a name for himself, the Ghost Division, this is when he made his I guess you could say his street creds. During at the very beginning, or when in 1940, World War II, when the German military launched their blitzkrieg west, and they conquered, Belgium, Denmark, Holland, France, all that, Rommel's division, he had a heavy tank division or a light tank. He had a tank division, and he was in charge of the spearhead of that. And he did a great job. He used deception. One of the things that he did, he had his men, so the whole thing about blitzkrieg, which in German is lightning war, which is how we fight wars today, such as in 2003 when the United States invaded Iraq. That's a perfect example of modern day blitzkrieg, incorporating modern day technology. A blitzkrieg is just a fast-paced, fluid war where you encircle your enemies quickly before they know what's happening. You cut them off from their command and control so that the top generals can't communicate with the front lines. Before you know it, everything falls apart. That's blitzkrieg, and that's what was developed after the huge stalemate of World War I's trench warfare. So during the May of 1940 blitzkrieg in Western Europe, Rommel was tasked with blasting through the Ardennes forest around the Maginot Line, which was a fortification line all along France's border leading all the way up to Belgium. It was a defensive line meant to keep them out. They considered the Ardennes impassable, the French did. Therefore, they did not build the Maginot Line there. The Ardennes forest, if you Google map it, is a very thick patchwork of heavy forest. The French didn't think the tanks can move through that. And again, keep in mind that tanks were relatively new. Only 20 years earlier had they been even introduced on the battlefields of World War I. And even then, they traveled 4 miles an hour, at best 5 miles an hour. They weren't very good. So he's blowing through. He went around the Maginot Line. He's going as fast as they can. I think at that time their tanks went like maybe 15 or 20 miles an hour. And they ran on petrol. So as they're blowing through France, they would stop at petrol stations and just load up with fuel as they went. At the beginning stages. That was an anecdote that I heard. So he's blown through. When they do, the whole thing with blitzkrieg is you spearhead with tanks. So when you do come across an enemy position, you don't stop, bog down, and fight it. You go around it because you're in a fast-moving tank as relative to the static infantry position. Follow-on infantry, after your tanks move forward, they take on this bunker. Let them fight it out. Your tanks keep moving. Whenever Rommel would come across something like that, he'd have his guys stick white flags out of the turrets. And there was a lot of confusion. Look up the phony war on Google, and I'll explain that, between France and Germany regarding, is there a war going on? What's going on? This made it look like this was a fragmentation of the German army that was anti-war, and they were capitulating essentially. So the French didn't fire at them; they let them go. Once France was conquered, one of the French generals that had seen the Rommel in action, he said, quote, "By the time we knew you," Rommel in his text, "by the time we knew that you were there, it was too late. You disappeared like a ghost." And that's how he got his name. That's the Ghost Division. Okay, so that's the preface on Erwin Rommel. Now we're going to lead into him invading Africa, which is the core of this video. Italy under Mussolini invaded Africa because it wanted to restore the glories of the Roman Empire, and they were pushing down south. They were going to try to get south through Sudan or Ethiopia or some crap. I'm not too familiar with that. The Italian military sucked. Very ironic given the history of the Romans. I know all the blood's mixed together thousands of years later, but still, it's ironic. I researched it a little bit, and sources say that the reason that the German military or that the Italian military sucked on the battlefield was because their officer corps was very corrupt. Like you would be promoted based on your social status as opposed to your ability to command on the battlefield. So that's what modern day scholars say is why the Italian military sucked. So anyhow, Mussolini is in North Africa, pushing into Africa with an army, an Italian army, and they're starting to win, but then they come across the British. And then the British start to fight the Italians south of Egypt, I believe. They begin to fight the Italians, and the Italians begin to lose. So once again, just like when the German military had to save the Italians in Yugoslavia and in Greece, the Germans went ahead and sent their best field commander, General Rommel, or one of their best, most certainly, with a 40,000 plus man Afrika Korps, spelled with K's. Africa without it's Africa with a K and then Corps with a K. So Rommel's Afrika Korps was landed in 1940, I believe, in Tripoli. Now keep in mind, the British Empire was alive and seemingly well at this point. They controlled North Africa, the British Empire. They controlled generally most of the Middle East. They controlled a lot of stuff back then, and they had a very strong navy and a very capable Air Force, the Royal Air Force. So I guess Tripoli is where the Italians landed. I would need to look that up. But Rommel and his Afrika Korps, again, 40,000 men plus, full of tanks. Tanks. Rommel's all about tanks. They landed in about 1940 in North Africa and Tripoli. And then the, quote, Desert War began. Now, let me just say outright that this is a Pyrrhic victory for the British Empire. They took massive losses. Massive losses. I'm just looking at my notes really quick. The open desert of North Africa is ideal for blitzkrieg tactics. Blitzkrieg is all about, you need open plains. Moving those tanks through the Ardennes in 1940, that was an ordeal. They managed to pull it off, but it was a freaking task. Having open plains, once they got past the Ardennes, the plains of France, it's very easy to maneuver through. So open, flat desert terrain, North Africa, perfect. So if you pull up a map of Tripoli, or pull up a map of the Mediterranean, North Africa, and all that, they landed, I believe, Tripoli. which was then controlled by the British Empire, because once Mussolini's Italy began, which it was at that point allied with Germany, once they began fighting Britain, then Britain began a naval campaign, I believe, against Germany. So Germany was like, WTF, screw this. They landed troops in North Africa under Rommel, 40,000 men strong, and they immediately, using Rommel's brilliant blitzkrieg tactics, they pushed under British General Montgomery, very overrated. They pushed him and his and his English army back hundreds and hundreds of miles east, from Tripoli east to the gates of Cairo, which is where the British Empire in the Middle East was centered. He was not properly resupplied, and the reason he was not properly resupplied is because of Operation Barbarossa, which was launched in 1941 against Russia. That's when Hitler decided, against his generals' advice, the same generals, by the way, like Rommel, who had conquered Western Europe, against his generals' advice, he went ahead and initiated his campaign against Russia in 1941. That's called Operation Barbarossa. And it was the largest land invasion ever seen in history, in the history of warfare. 5 million troops, land-based, invaded Russia. 3 million were German, and then the other 2 million consisted of Italian, Finnish, and then other smaller auxiliary forces from like Ukrainian, Hungarian areas, stuff like that. Polish auxiliaries. Look at my notes. I freaking beautiful minded this crap up. But I have to try to keep track, otherwise I'll ramble forever and I'll lose track. General Montgomery was the commander of all the British armed forces in North Africa. And the only reason that he won was because Rommel stopped being resupplied and he kept being resupplied. Montgomery kept being resupplied. You could even say he was oversupplied. Okay? Because of Operation Barbarossa. The British Empire, the British Army under Montgomery in North Africa was completely routed time and time again by Rommel. Rommel did weird crap. He would take trucks, like supply carrying trucks, and he would tie trees to them in like big palm frond branches from the desert. And he would get like a column of 30 of them. He would haul them off in the middle of nowhere. And the dust that went up into the air from that, you could see it for miles. So it would make the English on the front line say, okay, they're starting to move on our left flank. When in reality, Rommel's pulling, steamrolling up your right flank. And, you know what's going on. Rommel did this very innovative crap. Him and Patton were very similar. Patton had studied and read Rommel's book that he had written after World War I. As Rommel and Patton both fought World War I, and they ended World War I both in armored units, spearheading armored tactics. So the British were seated officially in Egypt. Had Germany, General Montgomery was commander of the entire, all the forces in Africa, like I said, and had Hitler in 1940 listen to his generals. It's not that his generals did not want to invade Russia. It's just they said, listen, we need a little bit more time to prepare. And Hitler said, no, don't do it in 1942. Don't do it in 1943. Do it, I believe, June of 1941. Excuse me. Or July of 1941. His generals were like, dude, please. And then Hitler's like, you're going to do it. So they did it. Had he waited, all those supply, a massive army I mentioned, we'll just take out those 2 million. Now the 3 million Germans, and all, think about this. Just step back and think about the logistics of this. All the food, the water, the ammunition, the spare parts, the mechanics, the mechanical equipment, the weapons themselves, the soldiers, their individual daily food rations, their packs, their equipment, their personal individualized equipment. All of that, or just take 50% of it, ship it to Rommel in North Africa. He's at the gates of Cairo. let him finish. Let him finish the job. I mean, let's see here. I mean, there's something that I wrote down here about him. Okay, okay. In the end, with regard to the campaign, the Afrika Korps campaign in North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps routed the British Army objectively, without any doubt. The British Army under General Montgomery, time and time again, routed hundreds and hundreds of miles. But right at the gates of Cairo, right on the brink of officially winning and kicking the British out of the Middle East, essentially, kicking the British Empire out, the Germans, they say, they being general scholars, historical scholars, the native Arabs would have welcomed the Germans as liberators. Both did not like the Jews, so you could see a natural alliance there. Rommel ran out of fuel at the gates of Cairo. And his tanks, he needed his tanks. That's how he kept winning, his tanks, and using deception like those trees and making dust plumes here and dust plumes there when the real attack is coming from over here or over here. You know what I mean? In the very end, Rommel could only travel 5 miles a day with his tanks, just in order to maneuver them defensively. Hitler couldn't, because of the freaking Russian campaign, Operation Barbarossa, launched in 1941, right 1 year after the Afrika Korps landed in Africa. Hitler couldn't, because of them, all the supplies going in Russia. He couldn't, or he refused, simply outright. Rommel's urgent, repeated calls for reinforcement and supplies. He kept saying, "Look, I know what's going on, man. We got him." You know, Rommel, he was a real tactician and a strategist. He knew what he was doing, and he said, "Look, we need to kick these guys out. We'll be greeted as liberators, and then I will continue." This is Rommel talking. I'm assuming we will continue into the Middle East, take the oil fields, secure our southern flank, make the Mediterranean into a German lake. So now you have that Roman Empire thing going. Screw the Italians. They sucked. You have the German lake. Have the Rommel move up through the Middle East in towards southern Russia. So pre-position for the next phase of the war. But he refused to give the reinforcements because Hitler failed to see the broader strategic significance in doing so. That mixed with an irrational personal hatred of Stalin. Hitler personally hated Stalin on a personal, visceral level. And also, Hitler was kind of drug-addled at this point. I don't know if you know this, but Germany invented methamphetamine. And Hitler used to wake up and get injections of methamphetamine. Then when he wanted to rest, he would get injections of morphine. And then when he wanted to go just pop off, he would freaking speedball. And he would get injections of morphine mixed with amphetamines. So by 1940, 1941 onward, Hitler had a steady decline where he just became increasingly drug-addled and isolated. Because of all this, Hitler failed to see the big game, the big picture, and he failed to secure his southern flank. As a result, Operation Torch ultimately was launched, which was when America, along with I think maybe the English, I don't know, officially engaged Germany in armed combat in North Africa when the United States invaded North Africa, I believe through Algeria, I'm not sure, during Operation Torch. My conclusion, really quick, well, number one, I don't know how long it's going to go. It's at 19 minutes. I don't know how long that this is going to go, or how long it's going to let me go, or how long I should even talk about. Okay, Malta had never been taken. Okay, Malta had never been taken. Malta is an island in the Mediterranean that's a little bit like southwest of Italy. If you control Malta, you control the Mediterranean. The British Empire controlled Malta. It's an island. You know, Google map it, look at it. They controlled Malta. You can see its strategic significance. The Royal Air Force, they were good at what they did. Any supplies that did manage to be sent to Rommel, the supply ships were bombed. The supply ships were bombed by the Royal Air Force. not enough focus was given on taking Malta. The Germans tried, but if they should have tried harder and they should have taken it. They should have postponed the Russian invasion, as Hitler's generals wanted from the very beginning. All 3 million plus men of all those German armies that invaded Russia in Operation Barbarossa in 1941, June, they could have been surged into North Africa to support Rommel. Britain's Montgomery would have continued his losing streak time and time again, over and over and over again. The British Empire ultimately would have been booted out of Africa. And, well, had this happened, now we go into the next stage of the war, which is establishing the Southern Front against Russia. Rommel's army would have moved up, grabbed up the Middle East oil fields, been greeted as liberators. We're assuming, or they are, the source material that I've read, they would have been greeted as liberators by the indigenous population, the Arabs. And at this point, the German military high command military machine should have stopped, regroup, reorient for a different mission. Now we're going to attack Russia. So at this point, in 1942, 1943, say, at this point is when Hitler should have launched his Russian invasion, Operation Barbarossa. And by the way, this is when his generals wanted to anyhow. It was around this timeline. Hitler launching Operation Barbarossa when he did in June of 1941 was the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. Despite Germany's early successes, outstanding blitzkrieg successes into Russia, Hitler, he quickly, once they invaded, he quickly assumed high command of everything military. He consumed high command of, and just like President Obama and ISIS in Syria, he micromanaged like everything from the tactical to the strategic levels in Russia. And he hated Stalin, like I said, so he became obsessed with Stalingrad. The German army was on the gates of Moscow. Hitler said, well, he commanded. At this point, he had assumed overall command against his generals. They were like WTF. Hitler said he split the army group going toward Moscow, and he sent the southern part of it into south down into Stalingrad to help fight. And they just got mauled up and eventually just mauled up and captured by the Soviets. That was the beginning of the end. That was the first major battlefield defeat for the Germans. Okay? So at this point, that's what actually happened. My counterfactual, 1942-1943, let Rommel do the thing that I just described, and then launch the Russian invasion. And the way it should have been done this time, launch the Russian invasion from the west and from the south out of the Middle East, Rommel. So you're hitting from the west and you're hitting from the south at the same time instead of simply the west. So now the Russians are fighting on two fronts. A second reason why Hitler wanted to move south into Stalingrad was to make sure that they could capture that industrial heartland and the oil fields of the Caucasus region of southern Russia. Rommel could have done that immediately. That army group that was about to seize Moscow could have stayed cohesive and could have seized it before winter set in, because then that's when everything started to fall apart. And that is the counterfactual being proposed. Stalingrad was the beginning of the end. What they should have done is let Rommel go up. They should have using blitzkrieg tactics. Rommel and his people, his army, should have encircled Stalingrad, bombed its industrial centers, seized the oil fields. That would have taken care of the strategic necessity, and then just put the city of Stalingrad, once it's industrial heartland, not the civilians, don't murder people, just the industrial heartland. Once it's been bombed, put the city under siege, and then move on. That's what blitzkrieg is. Put under siege, leave a garrison force, move on. Okay, so now you're launching an invasion of Russia, Operation Barbarossa, redo, launching from the west and from the south. Immediately seize southern Russia and the oil fields. The West immediately does what it did, which was amazing. If you look at the beginning parts of Operation Barbarossa, the German army did amazingly well. Rommel's Rommel's southern spearhead would have seized, what I said it did, would have formed a pincher move around Stalingrad, bypassed it, formed a pincher move to meet up with the northern armies that I just talked about. So the Southern Army invasion force would have connected with the Western invasion force. The Soviet Union was even under Hitler's ridiculously poor, inept military leadership. Even then, the Soviet Union was under near collapse. By this point, like I said, Hitler had replaced himself. The Russia was still, like I said, with that army group that almost seized Moscow. Had Hitler not made that strategic blunder, that tactical blunder, whatever you want to call it, to split that army group and move half of it south, and had he just seized Moscow, it would have been a fait accompli, and Russia would have been conquered. I mean, for all intents and purposes. I was looking at my notes really quick. Hitler didn't know what he was doing. He thought he did, but the same generals who had these innovative tactics, like Rommel and General Montgomery, who had conquered Europe in 3 weeks for Hitler, he started to doubt him, and he started to think, I'm the one who really did it. So he assumed that he was better now. Given my plan, without Hitler meddling, leave the war to the generals, which should be done in any kind of war, Russia would have lost. Germany would have secured its eastern flank. The resources would have been taken. The bulk of Germany's Wehrmacht, their army, their combat-hardened troops would have been sent back to Eastern Europe to prepare for the inevitable Allied invasion. The freaking bug on my computer. The Allied invasion. They would prepare for the Allied invasion in Western Europe. That would lead to a one-front war, which would have maybe led to D-Day not having worked. D-Day may have failed. And that's what part 3 is going to be about, is why D-Day was one of the reasons why Germany lost World War II. D-Day and Hitler and his absurdities. So that's my next video, why Germany lost World War II. Part 3 will cover D-Day. One of the main reasons why and how, from a military standpoint, Germany could have won if they were fighting a one-front war, and the southern flank in North Africa was secure, the eastern flank in Russia was secure, then the northern flank, because I think that they could have and should have continued on. Again, this was discussed in how Germany could have, or why Germany lost World War I, Part 1. Germany should have seized Britain immediately, and that would have taken care of his northern flank. All he would have had to have worried about would have been in his western flank and having control of the sea and the sky, and refortifying the Atlantic Wall, as it was called. Hitler failed to see the long game strategic framework of the scenario as a whole. Germany failed to prioritize by seizing Malta in the Mediterranean, which prevented Rommel from being properly supplied with any supplies that could be sent, given all that was going into Russia at the time. The British just bombed. They just bombed any ships that managed to get through. His tanks ran out of fuel in the end, Rommel, and he could not finish his job, which was to kick the British Empire out of Africa, which he came so close, he was just miles away from doing it, just a few more gallons of fuel. So the conclusion, excuse me, is number one, the conclusion for why Germany lost World War II. Part 2 is Africa, the Afrika Korps, that Germany should have secured Africa first, grabbed southern Russia and the Arab oil fields. Southern Russia invaded from the south, and Russia invaded from the south and the west simultaneously. Bull rush Moscow. Had Hitler not been such a freaking nut and a drug addict, and had he listened to his generals, the German military would have most certainly have won World War II in Europe. This is just a conclusion bullet point recap. What would have happened next? What would have happened next had they won? The Thousand-Year Reich would have been established. If you want to Google that, Thousand-Year Reich, that stretches from the Atlantic to the Pacific. What would today's Europe look like had Germany won? Hitler would have needed to be assassinated by the German high command, the capable high command who knew what they were doing. No more Holocaust, no more murdering. Instead, let's say a capable leader could be brought to the fore. They negotiate peace. Territorial exchanges are made. But in the end, the Holocaust has ended. The Fourth Reich begins. So the Weimar Republic leads into the Third Reich, leads into the Fourth Reich under another Kaiser, now reintroduced. What would today's world look like if such a thing were to have happened? What would things look like today regarding the migrants in Europe? And I bet Hitler's turning over in his grave, but he was burnt alive, they say, so I don't know. But if he knew what was happening, what Merkel was doing, Merkel's like the anti-Hitler. But the 1,000-year Reich, no more Holocaust crap, negotiate a settlement while your military is still strong, and have an empire, a German empire. Again, territorial exchanges that would have had to have been made in Europe, or Italy would have had to be taken into account, Mussolini and what he wanted to accomplish himself in North Africa. But I'm getting off track. This is part two of why Germany lost World War II. Coming to you from the Roundhouse Report. Today is April 10th. And there's light outside. Don't know what's going on. Today's April 10th, it's the Roundhouse Report. Please subscribe and please check my Minds feed out at www.minds.com/Jody Roundhouse. Jody with a Y, one word. Minds.com/Jody Roundhouse. That's another platform I use. Hit me up, subscribe, hit the little bell button so you get updates. Usually I follow breaking news. This is just a historical mini-series. Part 3 is coming real soon. All right. Keep it up. The Roundhouse Report.